guys, I'm your host Tara A. Devlin, and welcome to another episode of Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. How did you guys enjoy the Kune Kune special last episode? I'd love to hear from you guys, and if there are any particular topics or themes you'd like to see in future episodes, you can let me know over on Twitter at Tara A. Devlin, or you can join the Kowabana Discord, which is where I'm more likely to see things. You can find that link in the episode description, or on kowabana.net. On this week's episode, we're going to be looking at people's brushes with the other side. The first story for this week is an interesting one. This particular story caught a lot of attention when it was first posted in 2011, and people digging into it realized that a lot of the events mentioned in the story were actually real events. I'll be posting an internet mystery about this particular story on the Kowabana YouTube channel tomorrow, or in a few days if you're one of our fantastic early birds, so make sure you check it out. But until then, let's dive right in and find out what's going on with the blood-covered woman. This is a true story that happened ages ago. My family home is back in H City, A prefecture, and there was a murder case there. It happened before I was born, so this is the story I heard. It took place in an apartment on the second floor near the movie theatre in my neighbourhood. The criminal was an elementary school student who wanted money. The kid snuck in after the tenant went out, but was then discovered when she came back, so the kid stabbed her with a kitchen knife. The crime was brutal, so it was the talk of the town at the time. Then, several years later, the incident had begun to fade from people's minds, and a delinquent high school student moved into that same apartment. It was a countryside, port town with a lot of rough kids and gangs, so they often got into fights, stole things, and sniffed thinner. One night, they gathered at the apartment and they were making a lot of noise. They were suddenly a lot noisier than usual, so the neighbour got angry, thinking that they were sniffing thinner. Angry, the neighbour went over and opened the door when they saw it. A woman, covered in blood and dancing in the apartment while several of the teenagers jumped out the window. The teens screamed and ran, and the neighbour fell over, unable to move. But then, they realised something. That woman, dancing in blood, was the same person who had been killed in that apartment several years earlier. After that, the teens went to the police and there was a massive fuss. It even made the newspapers. I heard this story at my previous part-time job. One of my colleagues was one of those teenagers in the apartment at the time, so he gave me even more details about what happened. Apparently, a bunch of them had gathered that night to play mahjong. They absolutely hadn't been sniffing anything, and it wasn't an illusion either. As the night wore on and they got more worked up, someone suddenly screamed, and everyone made fun of the guy for it. But his face turned pale, and he pointed to the window. "A ghost!" he screamed, and there was apparently a woman crawling down the wall. Intrigued, a bunch of them got up to see it, and then they saw a woman dancing in midair. "What the hell?" they screamed, and at that same moment, the woman flew over and clung to the window. Everyone panicked and the room went into an uproar, which was when the neighbour came over. When the neighbour rang the doorbell, the woman disappeared, entered from the front of the apartment, and then started dancing in the middle of the room. Everyone jumped out the window and ran, although apparently my colleague didn't remember where exactly they ran to. Next thing they knew, it was morning, and they went to the station for questioning. As for why I'm telling you this story now, I recently heard some information about a criminal who murdered a family about 3 or 4 years ago, and then committed suicide. That criminal was the same elementary school kid who committed the murder in that apartment. I remember my colleague's face turning pale even as he told me the story. He never looked like that. If you look up the article, you'll probably find it. Remember, I'll be posting an internet mystery video diving into the real facts behind this story on YouTube tomorrow, so make sure you head over to youtube.com/Kowabana Japan to check that out. This next story sees a lonely young boy find an old mirror in the storage room of his house. He's surprised to discover he can see a little girl in it, and they soon become friends. One day, she invites him to come over and join her, and well, find out what happens in Nana-chan in the Mirror. When I was a child, I often spent my time alone. I lived in an old house in the countryside, so there weren't many children my age around. I had a younger brother, but he was still too small to play with me at the time. Before he was born, my parents and grandfather used to give me all their attention, so after that, I think I grew lonely. At any rate, in those days I generally just played alone. Being an old building in the countryside, our house had lots of small rooms. There was a storage room in the southwest corner, and it was full of old clothes and small items. At the time, sneaking in there and playing with all those things in lieu of toys was my favorite thing to do. When did I find that mirror? I'm honestly not so sure. It seemed that it had originally been a hand mirror, but when I found it, it was just a round piece of glass with no frame or handle. It was pretty old, but there was no rust or cloudiness on it. It reflected beautifully. And I also don't really remember when, but at one point I remember looking into the mirror and seeing a strange girl standing behind me. Surprised, I turned around, but of course, there was no girl there. It seemed she lived inside the mirror. I found it strange, but I wasn't afraid. She had long, light-colored hair. She looked at me over my shoulder and smiled. "Hello." Then, finally, we were able to exchange words with each other. I called her Nana-chan. My parents probably found it creepy that I locked myself in the closet and spoke to a mirror about all sorts of things, but they never tried to take it off me. Plus, they apparently couldn't see her. "I don't have any other friends to play with, so I'm always lonely," I told Nana-chan one day. "Then you should come over here and play," she said. "How can I get there?" I asked, and Nana-chan looked puzzled for a moment. "I don't know." "I'll go and ask," she said in a small voice. I wanted to know who she was asking, but for some reason, it felt like that question was better left unsaid, so I stayed silent. A few days later, Nana-chan appeared before me and smiled. "I know how you can get here. You can come over here and play." I was happy, but my parents always told me to speak to them first before going anywhere, so I replied, "I'll go and ask my mother first." Nana-chan looked worried. "You mustn't tell anyone. If you do, something terrible will happen, and we'll no longer be able to see each other." I didn't want that to happen, but I was scared of breaking the rules, so I stayed quiet. "So, why don't you come and play here tomorrow?" Nana-chan said. "Yeah." "Promise?" She held her little finger up in the air and smiled. I pressed the end of my own little finger to the mirror. For the briefest of moments, it felt warm. I couldn't sleep that night. I didn't tell my parents anything about Nana-chan, but as I lay in bed and stared into the darkness, I grew worried about all sorts of things. How would I get into the mirror? What type of place was it anyway? Why couldn't Nana-chan come here? How would I be able to return home? I grew more and more worried the more I thought about it. Then, finally, I grew scared of Nana-chan herself. I didn't go to see Nana-chan the next day, nor the day after that, or the day after that. I made sure never to go near the storeroom. In fact, after that I made sure never to go in there again. Several years passed and I moved out of home to go to high school in the city. After graduation, I started working in the city and then finally got married and started a family of my own. By this point, I had entirely forgotten about Nana-chan. Shortly after getting married, my wife fell pregnant, and it was decided she'd return to my family home for a while. I got sick of doing the chores at home and it was lonely with nobody there, so I started to increasingly think of reasons to visit and spend time there myself as well. One day, we had dinner there and I decided to spend the night. I woke up during the night and got up to go to the toilet. As I was washing my hands, I looked up into the mirror. I could vaguely see that storeroom behind me. The divider in the hall was open, and I could just barely see it in the dark. I suddenly remembered. I'd closed that when I went to the toilet. I turned around and, as I thought, it was still closed. But when I looked at the mirror again, it was open. I could see that white storeroom door floating in the darkness. All the hairs on my body stood on end. I remembered Nana-chan. Shit, I thought, but I was unable to tear my eyes off the mirror. The door moved. I turned around again, but the divider was still closed. The storeroom door in the mirror, meanwhile, was half open. Beyond it, something white shone deep in the darkness. I'd never felt so terrified before in all my life, but I stared at the white thing. It was that girl's familiar smile. At that point, my memories ended. When I came back to, I was in bed, and it was morning. What a creepy dream. After that, I didn't want to hang around the house any longer, and I had the day off, so I took the opportunity to return home. Our apartment had a parking area that was half underground for all residents. Even during the day it was dim, and I parked the car in my own space and then turned to look in the rearview mirror. Nana-chan was right there, behind me. Surprised, I turned around, but there was nobody in the back seat. When I looked at the mirror again, there she was, behind me. She stared right at me through the mirror. With her light-colored hair tied in ponytails on each side of her head, she hadn't changed a bit since I was a child. I was so scared I couldn't look away, and I looked back at her, trembling, when finally she smiled and spoke. "Hello." She continued, her smile never leaving her face. "Why didn't you come and see me? I've been waiting all this time." I didn't know what to say, so I remained quiet, but she continued. "Hey, why don't you come and play with me over here now?" She reached out towards the mirror with her hand. "Come and play! Over here!" "No!" I screamed. "I'm sorry, Nana-chan. I can't go over there. I can't." Both hands extended, Nana-chan remained silent. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my hands trembled, and then I said in a smaller voice, "I have a wife now. We're about to have a child. So..." I hung my head and fell silent. I stayed like that for a while, and then finally, nervously, I looked back at the mirror. Nana-chan was still there. "Oh, I see. So you've become an adult now. You can't play with me anymore, huh?" She looked sad as she said it. What a pity. Then she smiled. It was a simple, innocent smile. She's forgiven me, I thought. Nana-chan. If so, then I'll just play with that child instead. She disappeared exactly before I could comprehend what that meant. I've never seen her again since. 2 days later, my wife lost the baby. We've never tried for another child since. Japan is full of tiny, abandoned villages. It's how we end up with enduring legends like Inunaki and Sugisawa. A young man on a bike trip in Kyushu stumbles across one of these tiny abandoned villages and is forced to spend the night. It's something he soon regrets. Find out why in The Abandoned Mountain Pass Village. I enjoy going on solo tours with my off-road bike. Whenever I can get a few days together, I always head off on a trip. During the Obon holidays this year, I set out on a 3-night, 4-day trip to the southern tip of Kyushu. Of course, taking only the highways to reach my destination would be boring, so on the way, I stopped at numerous scenic spots and took some detours with nice-looking forests. On the first day, I spent most of my time on the highway. The engine was working great. Once I hit speeds of over 100 kilometers an hour though, the front wheel started to wobble a little, perhaps thanks to a previous accident. But it was still okay. I spent the night at a friend's house in Fukuoka. On the second day, I took mostly back roads. I stopped at hot springs on the way and just took things at my own pace. I also took a lot of photos around Aso. But I apparently went a little too far off track. My goal was still a considerable distance away by the time the sun set. I was right in between Kumamoto and Miyazaki. According to my plans, I should have been in Kagoshima by that point. Should I take the highway? I wondered. But there was a famous forest road up ahead that I'd really been looking forward to. Well, it wasn't like I had any plans to stay somewhere for the night, so there was no need to rush. I gave up and made my way towards the forest. The road wound through the mountains and the view was amazing. I was glad I went. Experiencing the extraordinary really was the best part of traveling, I thought, and then started my way back down the pass. A gentle stream flowed on the other side of the road. A small bridge crossed over it, and just past that was a tight, snugly fit shrine. Opposite that, a gravel road continued up the mountains. There was still time left in the day. The gravel road was nice and flat. There was no reason not to go up it. There were no houses and I hadn't seen any other riders. I wouldn't be bothering anyone by going up and having a look. I put my goggles back on and took off at full speed. I put my foot down at an easy-to-read corner and turned. How fun! There was no guardrail if I fell, but the road was lined with trees that would no doubt work the same way anyway. I rode in a daze, but it seemed at some point I'd picked up too much speed. I turned the corner too fast, and the back wheel slipped, and the bike turned. Instinctively, I tried to stand the bike back up, but it was going too fast. The very next moment, the block tires bit into the road. Shit, I thought, and both I and the bike went flying. It soared over my head, and I saw my beloved bike land upside down as it smashed back into the road. Now I'd done it. Luckily, I was tossed along the road, so I didn't hit a tree or anything. But of course, everything hurt like crazy. I slowly stood up. Didn't look like I'd broken any bones. I staggered over to my bike. The blinkers and mirrors had fallen off, and the speedometer had broken into tiny pieces. I tried starting it again anyway, but as I suspected, it did nothing. The front fork had twisted and pierced the tire, and it was already starting to get dark. Of course, my phone was also out of range. Nothing else I can do. I'll have to walk down. I dragged my bike to the side of the road so it would be out of the way, hung my jacket on the bent handlebars, and then put my bag on. Relying only on the light from my torch, I started walking back down, feeling utterly lost. I walked for 3 hours straight. Strange. I should have easily reached that shrine by now. The starry sky stretched out to my right, and the mountain sloped to my left as I walked. I was going the right way. Had I entered a side road at some point without realizing it? I looked at my map, but it wasn't very helpful. It was dark. It might have been cloudy too because there was little moonlight. Nor could I see the lights of the city. If I didn't have my torch, I probably would have fallen over the edge of the cliff and slipped at some point. I stopped to take a break and lit a cigarette. I could hear the sound of a river nearby, but I couldn't see the entrance to the shrine. So, I had come down the wrong way then. At any rate, I'd have to camp out for the night. I'd think about what to do when it was light the next day. I had to find somewhere safe where a car or bike wouldn't hit me if one happened to pass by. With that in mind, I started walking again. A short while later, the road suddenly opened up, and I was greeted with a sight I hadn't seen before. There was a village. Right there. Of course, none of the lights in any of the houses were on. It was a ghost town. Seemed I'd branched off somewhere and taken the road leading to this village. I shone my torch around, and most of the buildings were made of wood and falling apart. I could also see a rusty water tower. Looked like the village had been abandoned long ago. It was creepy, but also fascinating, so I took a look around. It was a rather small village, maybe part of a settlement rather than a village, and there were 5 or 6 small houses packed into a tight area. Most were covered in ivy, and their walls had fallen down, allowing me to see inside. Seemed there was no point trying to lock the door, huh? In the middle of the village there were some stone steps. There were several wells, but they were all covered. I took several photos to remember the occasion. I decided to sleep by the house that was the least degraded, so I leaned against the door, wrapping a towel around my head and covering myself in bug spray. When I thought about sleeping directly on the hard ground, I didn't even care. I was exhausted. I immediately fell asleep. Something nearby woke me up. It was coming from inside the house. It wasn't a presence. It was a sound. Something was walking around slowly. At first, I thought it might have just been the house adjusting, but the sound continued rhythmically across the floor, and it sounded just like footsteps. The top half of the entrance was covered in frosted glass, so I couldn't see in. No way. Is there actually somebody in here? I didn't think for a second that anyone lived there, but I pressed my ear to the door to check. No doubt about it. Someone was walking around inside the house. At some point, the moon had shown its face, and it shone down upon the creepy, empty gathering of buildings. I suddenly felt very terrified for the situation I was in. Of course I did. At that time, in an abandoned village deep in the mountains, there was no way anyone should have been there. My heart rate jumped up. Something unknown was right next to me. I was terrified. Something sounded slightly further away. I looked, but couldn't see anything. I was so scared I couldn't move a muscle. Sweat poured from my brow. It was the first time I'd ever experienced sleep paralysis. Only my eyes were able to move. Then, in the moonlight reflected off the window of the house directly across from me, a black figure darted across. A short while later, it cut across again. It seemed to be going back and forth. Was it walking around? The sound continued in the house behind my back. I couldn't bear it any longer, but my body refused to move, like it had turned to stone. Plus, it felt like if I discovered what lived in this abandoned village, then something terrible would happen. I moved my eyes and looked around. They appeared to have adjusted to the light because when I looked in the direction of the sound again, I saw a well. The covering had come off. And then I saw it. A woman stared at me from the well, her eyes poking up over the top. A pale face pressed against the window in the house in front of me, looking at me as well. The footsteps behind me stopped, and then a face pressed itself against the frosted glass, a single eyeball looking down at me. I screamed, and at that moment I was able to finally move again. I grabbed my helmet and took off up the road as fast as I could. I forgot to even use the torch and relied on the moonlight as I ran through the forest path. I just wanted to get as far away from that village as possible. I ran until my sides hurt, and then walked the rest of the way and waited for morning to arrive. I didn't feel like stopping again. I arrived back in town around the same time the sky in the east started to brighten. I decided to take the first highway bus back home that day. I had a local contractor pick up the bike and trash it. My body was covered in bruises. Honestly, it had been a cursed trip. Whenever I remember what happened, I feel like ghosts and those sorts of things really do exist. It was so real. Also, there are things that look like ghosts in the photos I took at that village. After seeing that, I thought, there really are strange things out in the world, huh? And I didn't notice it at the time, but in the highest spot of the village, behind the buildings, there were numerous flashes floating around some mossy graves. The nurse in this next story recounts something she experienced while caring for an elderly man in his home. The man, bedridden but otherwise healthy, soon complained of something dark trying to take him to the other side. Find out what's going on in The Black Thing. I'm a nurse. This story is about an experience I had at an extremely normal house in the countryside. An old man lived there with his children who took care of him, as well as his grandchildren and even great-grandchildren. I visited the house to help look after this old man. Of course, I wasn't there 24 hours a day. I was only there for about an hour at a time each day. This old man had a hobby that he absolutely adored, and even when he was falling asleep, he'd remember something and tell me all about it. This happened all the time. Because of that, it often felt like I was just having a friendly chat with the old guy. Yet, after a certain event happened, he started saying slightly strange things. He wasn't senile, and he had a very solid grip on reality, but he started saying things like, "I'm going to die soon," and "I'm scared." He was confined to bed, but it wasn't like he was on the verge of death. As long as someone cared for him, he would be fine to continue living at home. "No, you're not. Let's do our best together," I said to him. But then I heard it. According to the old man, a few weeks earlier, he'd seen something black sitting on his stomach, and day by day, it was getting bigger. When he moved to try and squish it, he then saw its face. "Come quickly," it apparently said to him. I listened to his story, afraid, but after his daughter explained it to me, I better understood. Apparently, everyone in their family had the ability to see the supernatural, and although they hadn't told him yet, the old man's cousin had recently passed away. His cousin lived far away, and hearing of his death would shock the old man, so they hadn't told him yet. They often played together as children and were good friends, so maybe he was calling for him, she said. During the night, the old man grew agitated and his temperature rose. They ended up having to call an ambulance for him. He received treatment, but they were unable to find out what was wrong with him, and his condition didn't get any better. He was constantly out of it and muttering about things that happened when he was a child. His daughter thought that maybe he was talking about his cousin, and maybe that cousin was lonely. She feared he was trying to take her father along with him. A few days later, he finally improved and soon his health returned to normal. I visited him for the first time in a while after he got out of the hospital, but as always, he complained. The black thing on my stomach is getting bigger. Apparently recently it had started saying things to him like, hurry up and come over here. Why are you over there? Don't leave me behind. He no longer feels frightened of it and apparently has started talking to it instead. They talk about the war and games they played as kids. So maybe it really is his cousin. Yet when I overheard them, it just sounded like a spell or a chant. So all I felt was fear. It might not seem very real, but that was what I experienced. Our last story for this week sees a group of young boys settle down to play a game of Kokuri-san, or at least a variant of it. Yet when they start making fun of the spirit, something terrible befalls them. Find out what in Communicating with the Dead. Quite a long time ago, there was a game called Fuyure-sama that was extremely popular. It was a game much like Kokuri-san. It doesn't matter what it's called, but when you play it, a wandering ghost from the other side approaches. So the name probably came from someone getting a little ahead of themselves. However, when we tried it with a 10-yen coin, it often didn't work, so we had to try it with a pencil, like the Angel Summer or Cupid Summer games. It moved around all funny-like. According to my friend, just like with Kokuri-san, you weren't allowed to ask how much longer you had to live. Still, it's hard not to want to know about your own future. One day, after we'd exhausted everything we wanted to ask about the future, I posed the following question. What type of life am I going to lead after this? 4 of us, the usual guys, sat in my room with the curtains closed and candles flickering, creating a creepy atmosphere. The pencil started to move. F, A, L, L. The temperature in the room dropped. Fall? A fall? Does that mean everything's going to go downhill or something? One of my friends laughed, although inside I felt rather blue. I called him a few names and acted tough about it, but then the guy next to us panicked. Oi, don't mess around. This is bad, he said, raising his voice. After a short silence, the friend who had been laughing at me suddenly spewed all over the table without warning, landing right on the paper we were using. Everything went to hell after that. The mood was destroyed and we all broke up. Remembering the tragic event that had happened on our school trip bus one time, I really didn't want to clean up that room, but I watched the others carry the guy out, and then my other friend approached me. "I told you, didn't I? You don't know what type of wandering spirit or jibakure might appear. What are you gonna do if it's an evil one? You should pour salt in all 4 corners of that room for a while." That friend, of course, could see ghosts. But for me, someone who couldn't, well, I couldn't confirm nor deny whether they existed or not. Until it happened. That night it was so hot that I couldn't sleep. Even though I was soaked in sweat, I covered myself head to toe with my blanket, like a bagworm moth. How many hours did I lay like that there for? Put salt out. Hearing such a thing made every faint sound seem even more ominous than usual. And even more so because I actually did put the salt out. I was too scared to poke my feet out from underneath the blanket because then something cold might grab them. Bang, bang! In the quiet of night, something suddenly banged on my window. In contrast to the soft sound, my heart pounded like it was going to break free of my chest. Bang, bang, bang! My heart beat so loudly that it almost erased the sound. Bang! I jumped and let out a pitiful groan. Panicking, I covered my mouth with both hands. Bang, bang, bang! Up until that point, I hadn't really believed in ghosts or curses or anything. I figured I never would. And because of that, the shock of what was happening was even worse. My brain worked at full speed trying to find a logical explanation for the sound. A drunk, a pervert, one of my friends playing a bad joke. But no matter what I thought up, all I could see in my mind was the figure of a ghost banging on my window. My room was on the 2nd floor. How much time passed? At some point, the banging on my window stopped. I peeked out from beneath my blanket. The room was pitch black. Beneath the blanket was so full of warm nitrogen from breathing in and out that I thought I was going to die. I couldn't do it any longer. I prepared myself and stuck my head out from under the blanket. There was nothing there. It was my usual room. The fluorescent needle on the clock said it was nearly 2:30. Morning was still a bit away yet. My fear levels had begun to drop. Yet the slightest sound sent them soaring again. Thinking about it, it was like I was holding onto a ticking time bomb. Would this same thing happen every night? On and on? Forever? No, there was nothing saying that this was the work of a monster. I tried searching for a logical reason again, this time with a cooler head. It's gotta be them. My 3 friends that had been in my room just a few hours earlier were probably standing on a ladder outside, banging on my window. The thought unexpectedly made me laugh. One of them standing at the top of the ladder and the other 2 holding it still. I tried to hold my laughter in, for various reasons. They totally would. That's why he told me to put the salt out, to scare me. When something banged again, I wasn't scared. I shot up. My pajamas were soaked with sweat and felt gross. I looked at the frosted glass window, but I couldn't see the silhouette of anything on the other side. I tiptoed over to it and listened closer. I couldn't hear anything outside, nor could I sense anything. They must have gone home. I felt somewhat lonely. I slowly unlocked the window and opened it a little without making a sound. Then I peeked outside through the gap. Another eye peeked back at me. "Ah!" I screamed and fell backwards on my ass. I stared up at the window from the floor. The thing with long hair stood upright where there was nothing to stand on, peeking in through the gap in my window, looking at me. It wasn't the eye of a warm, living human. The corner of the mouth grinned. There were no teeth, and blood dripped. "Get rid of it," her hoarse voice said as she rubbed her right hand along the window. The frosted glass turned red where she touched it. "Get rid of it. Get rid of it." She must have meant the salt. What would happen if I did? I didn't want to think of it. "Get rid of it. Let me in." From the bottom of my heart, I resented my optimism. If I'd just stayed under my blanket and bore how difficult it was to breathe, then I would still be fine. "Let me in. Let me in." Her bright red fist banged harder and harder on the window. I closed my eyes tightly, and then someone tapped me on the shoulder. I thought my heart was about to stop, and then I heard a familiar voice. "What are you doing? You're going to wake up the neighbors with those screams." It was my mother. Out of breath, I slowly turned to look at the window, but the figure was gone, and the sun was about to rise. After that night, I always slept with the storm shutters down, even during summer, and put piles of salt out. And as for that woman, I think she might have been the spirit of a woman who killed herself. I think she jumped off something and died. There was a building near where I lived that was a famous jumping spot. Those wishing to end it all would take a taxi there, people said. Luckily, I only saw half the woman's face, so maybe the other half was badly crushed or terrifying to look at. Thinking about it made chills run down my spine. As for the word fall, I don't think that was actually anything to do with her. I can't help but think that she was talking about my own future. Don't forget, you can find even more Japanese horror, including internet mysteries, bizarre crimes, haunted locations, and translations of old horror games over at our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Kowabana Japan. You can also help support this podcast and get early access and over 100 bonus episodes right now by joining our Patreon at patreon.com/Tara A. Devlin. Stay safe, guys, and I'll see you again next time for even more Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. Want even more scary stories? Head over to kowabana.net for new translations every week. You can also join our Patreon for exclusive stories you won't find anywhere else. Head over to kowabana.net now.